It's wonderful to be here, and tonight's topic is one of my favourite, perhaps second favourite, so I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And once again, we're going to go from what the Bible says. This is our guidebook, if you like. I hope you all agree with that. If you're new here tonight, just a little quick overview. It's all about this book here, the Bible. And tonight's a topic which comes straight out of the Gospels. Yesterday we looked at the Exodus from the Old Testament. Tonight is about a New Testament discovery. And we're going to go to the old city of Jerusalem. If you go to the Mount of Olives today, this is the sort of view you'll get. You can see the very well-known Dome of the Rock there. On the Temple Mount, this big square area here is where the old temple used to be, Temple of Jerusalem. And this is looking down across where the Kidron Brook would flow down here, up into the old city of Jerusalem. And of course, a very famous landmark just on the other side of these trees here is this wall here. You've probably heard of the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. And this is on a Friday night when all the Jews have come down to open the Sabbath. And you can see the wall here. Actually, if you look carefully, you can see there's two different sizes of stones here. You can see these large blocks of stones here. And along this layer here, above that, there are smaller stones. These large stones, which make up the bottom 2/3 of the wall, date back to the time of Jesus. The wall on the top is a more recent one, probably about 400 years old, when the Ottoman Turks were ruling this area, and they built that. But there's a lot of history in the city of Jerusalem, of course. Now, here's a shot taken from the air, our little radio-controlled helicopter again we used. And you can see the old city here in the yellow outline. Now, Jerusalem today is much bigger. It sprawls over a much bigger area. But the old city is within this yellow boundary here, you can see. And there's the Temple Mount here. Here's a photograph looking straight down to give you an idea of the size of the old city. It's not very large, the old city. Like from that bottom corner there across to here is only about 1 kilometre. From that corner up to here is only 800 metres. So it's only about 1 square kilometre, the old city. Here's another photograph looking from the air once again. And I don't know if you can see in this picture, but can you see there's a shadow running through here? Can you see that darkish area there? Jerusalem's built across 2 hills. Well, they call them mountains. In New Zealand, they probably wouldn't even get a name. One of them is called Mount Moriah, and the other is called Mount Zion. You may be familiar with those. If we draw on where those are, you've got Mount Zion. Well, they call it mountain, but it'd only be a little rolling hill here in New Zealand. And Mount Moriah is this one here. And on the far distance is the Mount of Olives. And Jerusalem was built across those 2 mountains. Hence, both Mount Zion and Mount Moriah are often associated with Jerusalem. Now here's a drawing of the old city. If you go there today, it's broken up into 4 quarters. There's the Jewish quarter, which includes the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. You've got the Arab or Muslim quarter up here. Then there's the Christian quarter and the Armenian quarter. Now if you come to the top of the city, you find the Damascus Gate. And that was sort of on the main road heading off towards Damascus, which sadly has been in the news a lot lately because of not so many good things going on there. But here's the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem as we see it today. And we know this is where the Damascus Gate was back in the time of Jesus because down the bottom here are those same large stones that are the same as on the Wailing Wall. It was built around about the same time. And in fact, there's a sign down here which indicates this was actually a Roman doorway down the bottom here. I should have a photo of that. Next time perhaps I'll have one. But the foundation of this gate here is the original Damascus Gate. The stones you can see here now date back to the Ottoman period. But down the bottom is the foundation stones for the original Damascus Gate. Now if you walk along the wall here towards the left, you come towards Mount Moriah. And if you walk along the outside of the walls, you come to this escarpment here, and you can see the walls of the city up on top here. But this bottom half is where sometime in antiquity they actually made a big slice. They cut into Mount Moriah because this is actually very good building material. Can you see this limestone here? It's actually very good building material. So they've quarried into Mount Moriah here, and they've created this dry moat. You can see the city walls up here. So if you're defending Jerusalem as a soldier, and you're standing up on the walls here, you've got a big advantage because the invading army will be down here. So they built the walls along that cut into Mount Moriah. And here's a little diagram showing that. Here's where Mount Moriah comes down through here to where the temple would have been and back up that area there. And Mount Zion was in this part here. So on the bottom end of Mount Moriah was where the temple was built. Now, can you think in the Bible where Mount Moriah is first mentioned? Somebody, I think, said it. The story of Abraham. You remember that? Do you remember God told Abraham something quite remarkable? Must have been quite a surprise to him. He says, "Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac," and here was the son of promise given to Abraham in his old age, "whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of." Abraham must have been quite shocked by this, but he was obedient to God. He did what God said. And you remember the story? How Abraham was about to slay Isaac, raising the knife, and God says, "Stop. You've proven how much you obey me." Because God was testing Abraham, wasn't he? But actually there was a lesson in this, wasn't there? God was teaching something about the Messiah who was to come. Just as Abraham had been asked to offer up his son, but God intervened and stopped that, one day God would send his son as a sacrifice, except that God would not intervene and Jesus would go all the way, didn't he? And it says they laid him in a sepulchre which was hewn out of a rock, and he rolled a stone to the door of the sepulchre. And here's an artist's conception of that. The Romans, they rolled the door shut, they sealed it, and set a Roman guard there, lest the disciples could come and steal the body and say he was resurrected. But did they have to do that? No. What happened resurrection morning? The angel came down and rolled the stone away, broke the Roman seal, and out came Jesus alive. And then the women came down later that morning to anoint the body. And what did they find? The stone was rolled away, Jesus was gone, and it says they saw two angels in the tomb. And what did the angels say? Very interesting to note what the angels said here. "He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him." Notice what the angels said. They said, "Have a look. Look at the place where they laid him. He's not here." And that's what we want to do tonight. We want to follow this instruction here from the angels. I would like to share with you the place I believe where Jesus' body was placed. So have a look at this. It's interesting, when the woman went back to the other disciples and said, "Guess what? Jesus is alive." This is, if you like, the first preaching of the gospel. And how was that message received by the other disciples? Well, the Bible tells us, it says their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. So very sad. Here's the first preaching of the gospel, if you like, and it wasn't even believed. And we've got a sequel to that story, which we'll have a look at the end, because something very interesting happens that same day. But before we get into that, let's ask the question, where is this tomb of Jesus today? Where is it? Would you like to see? Where's the place where the angel said, "Behold the place where they laid him"? Well, if we go to Jerusalem again, and if you go there today and ask, where is the tomb of Jesus, there's three main places that are put forward. The first one, the most popular by a long way, is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you can see by the arrow here, it's right in the middle of the city. Big dome there, and we'll have a look at that in a second. Another place that's been put forward fairly recently is way behind Jerusalem towards the south. It's called the Talpiot tomb, and that was put forward fairly recently by James Cameron. We'll have a brief look at that too. And another one which we're going to look at tonight is called the Garden Tomb, and that's just to the north. There's the Damascus Gate here, just to the north of the city, in this area right here. So which of these is most likely the tomb of Jesus? Well, let's have a look and go through. First of all, here's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right in the city. It's a very old building, and it's been added on at various times. Used to have arches here, and they've walled them up and put doors there. And when you go inside this building, you'll see many supposedly holy locations. For example, this slab of stone here is purported to be the place where Jesus' body was prepared to be buried. Therefore, some people perceive it as being significant and quite holy, and therefore, if you kiss this bit of stone, there's some merit in doing that. Now, I will put to you, there's no merit at all in kissing a piece of stone, even if Jesus' body was placed on there. But the people that come here are very sincere. I'm not going to question their sincerity at all. They're very, very dedicated pilgrims come here. But I'll put to you that Jesus is more interested in us knowing the truth than he is in us kissing a piece of stone. When you go inside this dome here, this tomb, you will find this little structure here. Now we know from the Bible the tomb was hewn out of rock. And you ask, where then is the rock-hewn tomb? And it's put forward that this is the place where the tomb of Jesus was, where this little construction is made out of stone blocks. Here's a picture of it here on, might have been Christmas or Easter or one of those days where a lot of pilgrims come with candles around this thing and they say, this is the place where Jesus' body was when he was resurrected. Now, if people ask, well, hang on a minute, where is the rock-hewn tomb like the Bible described? This is the explanation that's given. What they say is that there used to be, this is the argument, there used to be a hill here. You can see this this yellow stripe colour here. That used to be a hill into which was cut the tomb of Jesus. And at some stage, the early Christians wanted to preserve this site for future pilgrims to come to, so they basically removed the hill, took the hill away, including the tomb, and then they built the building over the top to say, well, it used to be here. This is where it used to be. Now, I'll put to you, does that make logical sense? If you had a tomb which was cut into rock and you wanted to preserve that, would you bulldoze the hill away and put a building over it and say, well, it used to be here? Does that make much sense? I'll put to you, not really. If you want to preserve a special tomb, you don't bulldoze it away or dig it away and put a building in and say, well, it used to be here. You leave it intact. Is that right? Yeah, that's the argument for this tomb. There's other problems with this location as well, and we'll look at those as we go through. The other one that's been purported or promoted quite heavily fairly recently is done by this gentleman here, James Cameron. Have you heard of James Cameron? He recently dived to the deepest location in the sea, and this is his little expedition. You might have seen that earlier this year. And he put his influence and money behind promoting this tomb here. This was discovered in 1980 to the south of Jerusalem. And after they did a little bit of work on this, they produced this documentary here. Here it is, The Jesus Family Tomb, forward by James Cameron. And they called it The Discovery, the Investigation, and the Evidence That Would Change History. Now, what was this evidence that would change history? You might have heard of this. If you haven't, here's a little bit of a recap. Inside this tomb were these, what they call ossuaries. These are stone boxes, beautifully carved. And what they would do, after the body had rotted away, they would put the bones of the deceased into these stone boxes. And they discovered in the ossuaries that were in this tomb, in one particular box, the bones of two individuals, and by DNA research they could tell they were not related. One was male, one was female. Therefore, they were probably husband and wife. And what James Cameron and others proposed was, those are the bones of Jesus. And he married Mary Magdalene. Have you heard that before? Here's a BBC webpage that showed this. Jesus had a son named Judah and was buried alongside Mary Magdalene, according to a new documentary by Hollywood film director James Cameron. Did you hear that when it came out a few years ago? Probably just as well. Tell me, do you find that story in the Bible here at all? Did Jesus marry Mary Magdalene and have children? You won't find that in here. Well, here's what the archaeologist who did the excavation work, this is what he said. I don't accept the news that it was used by Jesus or his family. The documentary filmmakers are using it to sell their film. And when James Cameron was challenged on this, he said, well, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a filmmaker. I looked at the evidence initially, and as a layman, I found it to be compelling. I haven't seen anything that contradicts the initial hypothesis. Well, what I want to put to you is this, and what we're going to do this evening is go through the Bible. Do you believe we can trust this book here? Amen. And I'll put to you, if you go to the Bible carefully and read what it says, it negates this idea that Jesus was married and buried in this family tomb. Because at the end of the day, we can trust the Bible. Does that make sense? If we're going to base our faith on the Word of God, we want to stand solely on this and not on some of these fanciful theories that are being put forward. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through the Bible now and pull out of the Gospels, the New Testament, all the clues that it gives for the actual tomb of Jesus. And you'll see when you do that, it makes it so clear there's only one possible candidate. And you'll see that as we go through. So here's 10 clues straight out of the Bible, rock solid, so we can trust this. First of all, it says the place where Jesus was crucified was, notice that, near the city. Does that mean in the city? No, it means just outside. Does that make sense? It's near the city, but not in the city. Important clue. Here's another clue. Bearing his cross, he went forth to a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha. So obviously the place where he was crucified and buried, there was a landmark, something that made it become known as the place of a skull. It says, now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre. The sepulchre was nigh at hand. So what we're looking for is a crucifixion site. Nearby is what used to be a garden, and in that garden a sepulchre, and it's all close by, close at hand. Now Joseph laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. So we're looking for a rock-hewn tomb here, not something made of stone blocks or even a hole dug in the ground. The Bible tells us it was hewn out of rock. Now here's a clue about the doorway of the tomb. It says, Peter, stooping down, beheld the linen clothes. Another time it says, Mary stood without at the sepulchre, weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the sepulchre. What can we learn from that about the doorway? Is it 10 feet high? No, obviously not. It's obviously low, such that you have to stoop down to look in. Does that make sense? That's straight out of the Bible. Now here's another clue. It talks about a time when a group of women went into the tomb. It says they entered in. And notice how many people are involved here. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women, plural. That's at least 2. So there's at least 5 people, probably more, that went into the tomb at one time. Now what does that indicate about the internal size of the tomb? Because some tombs in the Middle East are basically just a little hole cut into rock. You have to squeeze to get in just one person. But what can you tell about the tomb of Jesus from this? Obviously it's big enough for a group of people to go in. Does that make sense? So it's probably at least as big as your bathroom, if you can understand that. Here's another clue. Mary seeth 2 angels in white sitting. Notice that. The one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. So wherever the body of Jesus was, there's a place, obviously, where you can sit at each end of the body. Does that make sense? That's what the Bible's telling us here. Here's another clue. Entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting, actually that's the angel, on the right side, clothed in long white garments. So there's another clue. This is straight out of the Bible. So you walk in the doorway, stoop down and go in, and which side was where the body was? Is it on the left or the right? The Bible tells us it was on the right-hand side. So there's a clue as well. All these little details the Gospels give us, and you'll see why it's so important as we go on. The doorway itself, it says he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre. And in the Gospel of Mark it says the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. So what did they use to shut the door of the tomb? Did it have wooden hinges? No, it had a big rolling stone. And not only that, it was notable because it says it was great, very great. So this stone was larger than normal. Now here's another clue, last one out of the Gospels. Pilate said, make it as sure or secure as you can. So they went, this is the soldiers, and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. So the Roman soldiers sealed that stone. So here's 10 clues you can pull straight out of the Gospels that we need to find if we're going to find the right location. So it'll be near to, but not actually in the city of Jerusalem, near a place that was known as Golgotha, or a place of a skull. It was in once what used to be a garden. It will be cut out of solid rock. The entrance requires you to stoop down, but there's standing room inside for a number of people. It should be possible to sit at the ends where the body was, and the body would have been on the right-hand side of the tomb. The door was a big rolling stone, and the door was secure and shut by Roman soldiers. Now, there's even more we can get from the Bible. You know, when all the Jewish sacrifices, whenever they killed an animal, was merely symbolic, wasn't it, of what would really happen in the future when Jesus came. And the Bible says these are a shadow of things to come. Now, if we go back to the Old Testament, there's actually a few more little clues we can glean about the tomb of Jesus. In the book of Hebrews, it brings this principle out here. It talks about the bodies of those beasts, this is the sacrificial animals, whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin, are burned without the camp or outside the camp. And then the writer goes on to say this, wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate or outside the gate. Can you see the parallels there? It's saying what they did with the sacrificial animal being burned outside the camp was merely symbolic of Jesus who suffered outside the gate of the city. Can you see the parallels there? And we can learn a lot from studying the Old Testament that way. We're going to do a lot of that on another night about the Ark of the Covenant. One thing to notice about what they did with the sacrificial animals, they were told to carry forth the ashes. This is the remains, if you like, the body of those sacrificial animals, without the camp unto a clean place. Another verse says, lay them up without or outside the camp in a clean place. So after the animal was killed and burned, the remains, the ashes, they took them outside and put them into a clean place. Now, what does it mean by a clean place? Does that mean they got a broom and swept it and made it nice and clean? No, this is talking about ceremonially clean. Do you follow that? Do you remember the lepers when they got disease? They had to go saying unclean, unclean, because they were unclean ceremonially. So here's a question. What would make a place clean or unclean? Well, here's some clues from the Bible. It says, he that toucheth the dead body of any man shall be unclean 7 days. A dead body was considered unclean. And here's another passage. Whosoever touches a dead body or a bone of a man or a grave shall be unclean 7 days. Do you get that? A grave that had been used, that had even just a bone in there, was considered unclean. Do you follow that? Now that raises an interesting question. The remains of the sacrificial animals had to go to a clean place. Do you follow that? But a grave that had been used was unclean. What does that tell us about the grave that Jesus was placed in? We get that from the New Testament. Here it is. When Joseph had taken the body, he laid it in his own new tomb. And in John we read this, in the garden was a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. Now why is that important? Because if that tomb that Jesus was placed in already had bodies in there, would it have been clean or unclean? Unclean, exactly. But the prophecy, the sacrificial animals always had to go to a clean place. That was, if you like, a prediction that Jesus would be placed in a tomb that had never been used. So for hundreds of years, the Jews used to take their sacrificial remains of the animals, take them to a clean place, predicting that Jesus would be placed in a new sepulchre. Now, if Jesus was placed in a tomb that had been used before, he would have destroyed the prophecy. Do you follow that? And that excludes what James Cameron is saying, because James Cameron is saying, here's a tomb that was a family tomb, it had bones of other people in there, and Jesus was put in along with all these other bodies into this common tomb. Can you see how this here would prove that that cannot be the case? The Bible excludes what James Cameron is suggesting. Now, one more clue from the Bible before we get into having a look at this tomb. Which direction should we be looking? Here's a big, big clue. Go back to Leviticus 1. When a Jew brought a sacrifice along to be killed, they were told very specifically, he shall kill it on the side of the altar, notice this, northward before the Lord. So which direction, in relation to the altar, did they have to kill the sacrifice? To the north. Now there's a clue. So let's follow these clues here. Here's the picture of Jerusalem again. There's the four corners you can see here. There's the outline. Now if we draw lines between the corners, from that corner to that corner and this corner to that corner, and find the center point of Jerusalem and then head north, we come to an interesting location. Here's that line from the center of Jerusalem coming up through here. There's the walls of the city here. You actually come to an Arab bus station, would you believe? Not that that's significant. Here's the picture of the bus station here, looking down from the walls of Jerusalem. You can see the buses here. But at the back of the bus station is something quite interesting. A little bit hard to see. This is a picture I took a couple of years ago. Have a look at this picture here. This was taken back in the 1800s, about 100 years ago, 140 years ago now probably. What can you see here? Does that look vaguely reminiscent of a skull face? Remember, it says the place where Jesus was crucified was the place of a skull. And when you go to Jerusalem today, you can still see this outline that looks like a skull face. This was not carved, this is not man-made. Those holes there are actually natural. When they quarried into that mountain, Mount Moriah, and they cut a big slice through there, it exposed those natural cavities, and it looks like a skull face. I imagine 2,000 years ago it was probably very distinct. Now, back in the 1880s, this gentleman here was walking along the walls of Jerusalem. He looked across and he saw this, and he thought, wow, maybe that's the real Golgotha of the Bible. So he went looking, and not far away, a tomb had been discovered some years before. And you can see how close it is. That's where the skull face is. There's a bus for scale, so that gives you an idea of the size. So several bus lengths away, a tomb had been discovered. And here's a picture of it here. It had been discovered by the man who owned the land. He was a Greek businessman, and he owned this property here. And at the time, it was full of rubble and debris and dirt. And he began clearing that away. And he discovered this tomb here. And one side of it actually collapsed because it had an earthquake crack in it. So the stone fell down, and he bricked it up here. And he was going to turn this into a garden shed to keep his tools in. And General Gordon came along around about that time and said, hang on, this may be the tomb of Jesus. He knew his Bible very well. And so they bought the land. He arranged a group back in England to buy the land off the Greek businessman. And you can go to Jerusalem today, follow the signs and go to the Garden Tomb and visit this. And many people do this. It's a very popular site, not as popular as the Holy Sepulchre Church, but still a lot of people come here. Now, could this be the actual tomb? Does it fit? Well, if you go there today, it's a beautiful garden, very nicely done. But just because it's a garden today doesn't prove it was a garden 2,000 years ago, does it? But a couple of things show that it probably was. First of all, on the site, there's a big wine press, and you'll see this on the video later. Also, there's a large water cistern beneath the ground level there. Huge water cistern. You'll see a picture of this on the video. One of the largest in Jerusalem. And that would be consistent with this being a garden back in Jesus' time. Now, this is an artist's conception here. That stone there has been drawn in to show the size of it. And they can tell how big it is because of the width of the track here. This is where the stone would have rolled. And another amazing clue, which you're going to see on the video, which we're going to play shortly. Now, if you look at the interior layout of this tomb, here's the doorway here. Number 1 is where you come in. Number 4, they call it a loculus, or a burial place. And notice which side of the tomb it's on. It's on the right-hand side. Number 6 here, you can see, is a weeping chamber. And you'll see on the video that's big enough for a group of people to come in. So all the clues seem to fit very nicely. The people who own this place have put this little barrier there to stop people taking souvenir chips of rock away. But here's the place. This is the place where, if this is correct, this is where the body of Jesus would have been. And this is the place where the angel would have said, "Behold the place where they laid him." Now, could this be the right place? Could this be the tomb? Well, it ticks all the boxes. It's close to, but not right in the city. It's near a place that looks like very much like a skull. There's good evidence it used to be a garden. It's cut out of solid rock. The entrance is low, but the actual doorway would have been a very large rolling stone. There's standing room inside. There's a place to sit at each end, and you'll see this on the video. The body's on the right-hand side. It's ticking all the boxes. What about the Roman seal? What do you think about that? Because don't forget, Pilate said, make it as sure or secure as you can. And so they sealed the stone, and they set a watch. Now, I'd like to go for a second back to the city of Rome. Before we play the video, there's a little clue on a share to do with the Colosseum. Has anyone been to the Colosseum in Rome? Anyone here? A few of you, okay. You may recall when you went to the Colosseum that there's lots of holes all over the stones in the Colosseum. You can see them there. Looks like erosion, but it's not actually erosion. Do you know what those holes are? Here's a picture of me standing next to some of these holes. This is a column or a pillar made up of square blocks. Can you see this, the joins there and the seals here? Where they've stacked up these big square blocks to make some of the columns for the Colosseum. And what the Romans did was actually quite clever, because, you know, Italy is subject to a lot of earthquakes. I don't know if you know that. They get a lot of shakes. And yet the Colosseum, this is still standing even though it's almost 2,000 years old. And they've had some big earthquakes, except one half of it sort of collapsed. A big piece of it collapsed in a big heap. But the rest of the stones that remain standing are locked together very tight. They didn't shake apart. And the way they did that was this. Between the blocks, where I'm pointing, you can actually see, a bit hard to see here, but that there is an iron pin, a big square iron pin, and it's encased in lead. All around it is lead. Because what the Romans would do, when they put two blocks of stone together, they would cut a hole in the bottom of the top stone and a hole in the top of the bottom stone. They'd put an iron pin in there and put the stones together. Then they'd put hot lead down a little tube which would surround the iron pin. And when the lead set hard, you'd have the stones locked together with like a lead shock absorber. You know, the Te Papa Museum in Wellington actually sits on big lead plates. So if there's an earthquake, the lead absorbs the energy. Do you know that? And the Romans effectively did the same thing here. Here's the top of a column. This is a column made up of sections. You can see the round shape here. And you can see the hole where they've cut here, and you can actually see the dry lead along this little passageway here. Here's the other half. This is all lead that you can see there. And that square hole is where, when the Roman Empire was conquered and different tribes came down and broke up the Roman Empire, they wanted iron to make weapons, like swords and things, and they found a good source of iron was the Colosseum. So they went and started digging into the stones to find these iron pins so they could smelt them down and make swords and weapons. And that would have had an iron pin sitting in there. They weren't interested in the lead, they didn't want that, but they wanted the iron. So here's the columns. They ripped them apart and pulled the iron pins out to smelt them down. So that's how the Romans built their buildings in earthquake-prone Italy, by locking them together with iron pins encased in lead. Now, with that in mind, we're going to show you a video Is it possible for you guys to run it back there, or should I do it here? Okay, great. This video, it's about a quarter of an hour long, and it'll show you around Jerusalem, some of the sites. Then we're going to go and visit the tomb, and you'll see how it matches all the clues. And then there's a little interesting thing about the Roman seal at the end. Jerusalem is a focal point for three major religions. Behind us is the major symbol of the Muslim faith, the Dome of the Rock.
In the shadows of this olive grove, 2,000 years ago, began the most significant events in history.
Matthew 26:36 tells us that Jesus came to the Garden of Gethsemane after he had the Last Supper with his disciples. We're in the Garden of Gethsemane area, and you can see these old olive trees here. These date back hundreds of years, if not thousands. And this is the area just beneath Jerusalem where Jesus came on that fateful night.
It was here, in the Garden of Gethsemane, on that fateful night, that Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples.
It was in the Garden of Gethsemane that Jesus made the decision to go all the way and save the race of man. He prayed, "If it be possible, take this cup from me." But then he said, "Nevertheless, not my will be done, but thine."
To the north of the old city is another garden connected with the last days of Jesus' ministry on earth. In the bustling Arab quarter of Jerusalem, there is an oasis of peace, the Garden Tomb. Discovered in 1867 by a British general, an association was formed in Britain to purchase and maintain the property. On the property is an ancient Jewish tomb dated by archaeologists to be from the time of Christ. It is hewn out of solid rock, and the tool marks of the workers are still visible.
Go in your heart and mind to the New Testament.
Now we do read in the New Testament that as the women were approaching the tomb, the first resurrection morning, the one question they had in their minds, above all, was an obvious one, but nonetheless, they were asking themselves, who will roll away the stone? We're told Joseph's tomb was sealed with a great stone. Now,
this here is that tomb, a first century Jewish tomb hewn into rock.
It once had a large rolling stone to cover the doorway, as the Bible describes. In all points, it precisely fits the tomb described in the New Testament that Jesus was placed in. Down to the smallest details, like the low doorway and the interior layout, it matches the Bible perfectly.
There's some wonderful evidence that this is the actual tomb of Christ. Of course, the crowning evidence is that it matches what the Bible says. This is the weeping chamber beside where the body would have lain. As you can see, this is large enough for a small group of people to come in, and that again fits the Bible clues. It would have had a door that would have gone from where the stone stopped here, right across to this point here. That we know from some wonderful evidence, which we're going to talk about shortly, right here. John chapter 20, verses 11 and 12. But Mary stood without at the sepulchre weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the sepulchre, and seeth two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. We can see here a place where an angel could sit, and on the opposite side, likewise, a place where an angel could sit. The doorway is just here. Someone could look right on the door and see, just here, where the body would have lain. This is the spot where Jesus' body was, and where Mary saw the angel sitting here and over there, two angels. Two other significant discoveries on the property help confirm that this was a garden in the time of Jesus. One of the evidences that this was indeed a garden 2,000 years ago is this wine press, one of the largest in Israel. In the garden is an extremely large water cistern. We can see it down here. It's actually the third largest in Jerusalem. And here we have a picture taken from inside the cistern. You can see the size of it. This cistern dates back to Roman times. This cistern is at least 2,000 years old. That's another strong clue that this was a garden during the time of Christ.
The tomb itself is located very close to Skull Hill, which was known in biblical times as Calvary or Golgotha.
We're on the walls of Old Jerusalem, and over here there's a lookout point where we can see the eye sockets of Golgotha. Come on, we'll show you that. Behind us we can see the eye sockets that General Charles Gordon saw back in the 1800s. It was this that made him realise this is the real Golgotha right here.
Even after centuries of weathering, the skull face is still easily discernible. It was a very appropriate landmark for the crucifixion site that was here in Roman times.
Matthew 27:33 tells us, when they would come unto a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of a skull. Where Jesus was crucified was near a place of a skull. In the cliff behind us we see what General Gordon saw back in the 1880s, where the cliff had been cut through to make the quarry between here and Jerusalem. It exposed a skull face.
Still visible beside the tomb is an amazing piece of evidence. When the angel rolled the stone away from the door, the iron rod hammered in by the Roman soldiers was sheared off, and the remaining portion of it is still there today.
For years, Ron's critics stated that it was not an iron pin, but rather shrapnel that had lodged in the wall in recent times. It seemed to me that if the metal was of modern origin, an analysis of the object would reveal an alloy rather than the basic metals which were employed by the Romans.
With permission from the Garden Tomb Association, Richard was given the privilege to drill a small hole in the metal object and to collect the filings that were produced. Arrangements were then made for Hebrew University, Department of Earth Sciences, to analyze the sample by way of their scanning electron microscope.
This is metal?
Right.
Okay.
And a lot of it is rust, but there are some good pieces of metals in that rust. We'll have to kind of put it out on something and pick out some small, that's not rusty to look at.
In order to acquire accurate data, careful preparation of the specimen is an essential part of the process. Painstakingly, the samples were placed one by one onto an automatic stage and inserted into the sealed electron chamber for analysis.
Here we have two types of detectors. We have WDS detectors, which are wavelength dispersive spectrometers. Those are those 4 boxes. And we have an EDS detector, which is this one, with the liquid nitrogen on it.
First, an analysis was performed on the central portion of the object.
Must be iron, isn't it?
Yeah.
What's the other one right to the right of iron there? 2 different irons?
2 pieces of iron.
Okay.
During preparation, the material from the inner and outer portions of the metal object had been carefully separated. A scan of the outer material yielded an important discovery. The material surrounding the central iron object consisted of lead.
Okay, this is lead.
That's lead right there.
The microscopic analysis revealed not a modern-day alloy, but rather the basic metals of iron and lead. After reviewing the findings, the Israel Antiquities Authority immediately pronounced the object to be an iron pin set in lead. It seems that in order to secure an iron pin in stone, it was common to cut a hole, fill it with hot lead, and then drive the pin into place. When the lead hardened, the pin was secure. We find that the Roman Colosseum was built in the same fashion, using iron pins set in lead.
They just found that exactly what you've said. There are 2 metals in there, and it's a familiar amalgam that was used in the time of the Romans. So it could well be. It is at least consistent with the tomb having been sealed and a guard set with some sort of pin or something there to stop the stone rolling away.
In Roman times.
Yes.
Okay. Alrighty, well I hope you enjoy that. The bottom line is the evidence fits that this is the tomb of Christ. It's in the right location, all the clues fit, and even down to that Roman seal, which has been proven, as you saw in the analysis, it's Roman. Now, I'd like to finish on a little sequel to the story we had at the beginning. Remember the women came down to the tomb, they saw 2 angels, and they went back to the other disciples and said, guess what? We saw angels. Jesus is alive. And remember, the angels didn't believe them. Sorry, the other disciples didn't believe them. Now, here's the continuation of that story we find in the book of Luke. It says, behold, 2 of them went that same day to a village called Emmaus, which was from Jerusalem about 80 furlongs, which is about 12 kilometers. So they're a bit of a hike. And it says, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were holden, so they would not know him. And in another Gospel of Mark, it says he appeared in another form. So somehow Jesus disguised himself and joined these two guys walking on this road. And he said unto them, what manner of communications are these that ye have one to another as you walk and are sad? Now, did Jesus know what they were talking about? Of course he did. But he's trying to draw them out in conversation here. And this is what they said to him. They said, art thou only a stranger in Jerusalem, and hast not known the things which are come to pass there in these days? Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, which was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. Now, can you see what they've done here? They believed he was the Messiah. But they didn't expect him to be crucified, did they? And here they are in their own minds trying to reconcile what has just happened with Jesus and their expectations of him. And so they've actually, in their own minds, they've downgraded him a bit from being the Son of God to being a prophet. They said a prophet, a mighty prophet, but only a prophet. You can see they've sort of downgraded him a bit. And how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and have crucified him. And then they said this, but we hoped that it was he who should redeem Israel. In other words, they're saying, we thought he was going to be the Redeemer, the Messiah. But sadly, he got killed. So he was a prophet, a mighty one, but only a prophet. And then they talked about the women. They said, yea, certain of our women also of our company made us astonished, which were early at the sepulchre. And when they found not his body, they came, saying they had seen a vision of angels, which said that he was alive. Now, what was Jesus thinking at this point, do you think? Well, here's what he said to them. And you can hear the gentleness in his voice, but he's a little bit of a rebuke there. Then he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Now notice what he says here. He doesn't say, slow to believe what the women told you. What does he say? Slow to believe the prophets. And he went on to do this. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So what did he do here? He basically gave them a Bible study. Can you see that? And this is why he disguised himself. Because if he had appeared to them and said, look guys, I'm alive, do you think he could have taken them through the Bible carefully like this? Probably not. They would have been so overwhelmed. They would have gone, whoa, what's going on here? And, freaked out. But he disguised himself and gave them a Bible study. And it wasn't until they got all the way to Emmaus and they invited him inside his house and they went to have a meal together that it says, then their eyes were opened and they knew him. Now there's a very important lesson in this here. Jesus could have appeared to them on that road and said, look guys, I'm alive. Look at my hands. And they would have gone, whoa, But Jesus was more concerned with proving to them from the Bible who he was than even what they saw with their own eyes. Does that make sense? He wanted them to trust this here more than what they saw with their own eyes. Does that make sense? And that's a very important lesson for us today, because in Matthew 24, we may cover this one evening, Jesus says one day people are going to come to you and say, lo, Christ is here. Someone might come up to you one day and says, guess what? Jesus is here. I've just seen him down at the local supermarket. He's down in the shopping mall. He's come back to earth and you've missed him. And what did Jesus say about that? Now the people that do that are going to believe they've seen Jesus with their eyes. They would have seen this glorious being. And Jesus says, believe it not. Because when he comes back, and we'll look at this another evening, when he comes back, nobody is going to miss it. It's going to light up the whole sky. No one will ever have to come to you to say, Jesus has come back and you've missed it. I've seen him with my own eyes, because their eyes will have deceived them. It won't be Jesus. Very important lesson. So the bottom line is, we need to trust this book even before we believe what we see with our eyes. Does that make sense? Very important lesson.